This is the Thanksgiving dinner that inmates at Alcatraz Prison ate in 1946. So, I'm going back in time to recreate a Thanksgiving meal from America's most notorious prison ever, and to unpack some surprising untold stories about the history of Thanksgiving. So I figured that as it's Thanksgiving, I really wanted to experience a traditional American food coma. But I'm more interested in history, and the history of Thanksgiving is a bit murky. The idea of me Brit-splaining the legacy and history of Thanksgiving felt like a bit of a bad idea. Especially at a time of year that's so special to Americans for eating themselves into a stupor or avoiding eye contact with that cousin who's still trying to sell you on crypto. But there are still plenty of weird and wonderful food stories from Thanksgiving history. And one of my favourites comes from 1946 and the original menu of the Thanksgiving dinner that was served to prisoners on Alcatraz Island. To get us started on our journey towards an Alcatraz Thanksgiving, I'm going to brine a 5-kilo turkey. I'm going for a dry brine as I want to encourage crispy skin. I'm patting down my turkey with paper towel and then combining in a bowl 250 grams of salt along with 2 tablespoons of baking powder. The baking powder will help lower the temperature at which we start to get crispy skin. Mix together and then sprinkle from on high to get an even spread across the turkey. Once we have a good coating, I'm covering loosely with cling film and placing it into the fridge for 48 hours. 2 days later, it's time to cook our turkey. I'm laying the turkey down onto a trivet of chopped onion, carrot and celery and placing 1 halved clementine and some sage leaves into the cavity. I'm then putting it into a preheated oven and cooking for about 3 hours until my temperature probe tells me we've reached 70 degrees. That temperature will then continue to rise up to 75 as we rest it for the next 45 minutes under a layer of tin foil and then a tea towel. And now we need to make the giblet gravy. Do your best to procure the choicest cuts of turkey offal and brown them in a large roasting dish with some vegetable oil. Once lightly browned, I'm adding in some chopped onion, carrot, celery, whole garlic cloves, parsley, thyme, sage, salt, peppercorns, and one tip I learned from Jamie Oliver, I'm going to chuck in a small star anise pod for an extra flavour dimension. On top of this, add a layer of chicken wings. Optionally, you can also use the blunt side of a heavy knife to crack the bones. This will help release more collagen and flavour into your gravy. Place the tray into a hot oven for about 40 minutes until the chicken wings have picked up some colour. Remove from the oven, sprinkle in a few tablespoons of flour, then return to the oven for another couple of minutes. Then once you've cooked off the flour, return the pan to the hob and add 2 litres of water. Bring to a boil, then reduce and simmer for an hour or 2. In that time, our gravy should thicken and darken in colour. Season for taste, strain and set aside for later. So most of us know Alcatraz as a prison, but how far back does the island's history actually go? A lot of it isn't documented, but we know that a number of Native American tribes were living in the San Francisco Bay Area for thousands of years before the Spanish arrived in the 1700s. The Spanish had heard reports about Russian fur trappers in the area and they stumbled upon the bay. Then in 1775, one Spaniard created the first ever map of the bay. The story goes that he noticed an island with lots of pelicans on it, and named it La Isla de los Alcatraz, meaning Island of Pelicans, and over time the name morphed into Alcatraz. Then in 1848, after the American-Mexican War, the US took control of California, including Alcatraz Island, and by 1853 Alcatraz had been turned into a military fort to protect the Bay Area. Then in 1934 it opened as a federal prison specifically for offenders who had been troublemakers at other prisons. Over time it became famous for things like harsh isolation, riots and escape attempts, which is still how most people know it. One element of the Alcatraz Thanksgiving menu was celery dressing. I found a celery stuffing recipe courtesy of the US Bureau of Home Economics from 1937. The recipe tells you to add 3/4 cup of turkey fat or butter and melt it in a pan. To the melted butter, we need to add 1 small chopped onion, 1/2 cup of chopped parsley, and 1 pint of celery, which has to be one of the most disappointing references to a pint I think I've ever heard. Saute for a few minutes, then add 2 quarts of dry breadcrumbs and 2 teaspoons of salt. You might think that this whole meal feels a bit lavish or excessive for prison food, particularly as Alcatraz was supposed to have housed the worst of the worst offenders. But by all accounts, the food at Alcatraz prison was actually surprisingly good, and definitely much better prison food than others across America. And this is because the warden of Alcatraz looked at the data and realised that most prison riots across America partly began due to bad food. So he made a plan to make sure they were investing in good food that meant prisoners were less likely to riot. The prison guards were even said to have eaten the same meal as the inmates, so it can't have been that bad. Next up is hot biscuits. I obviously come from a country where biscuits are a very different thing. So, to improve my understanding, here's a recipe for buttermilk biscuits from an American newspaper in 1939. Into a mixing bowl, sift 170 grams of self-raising flour, add 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, and 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. Then sift it all again, and mix in 4 tablespoons of cold, unsalted butter and rub it until the mix resembles breadcrumbs. The recipe then says to add 150 ml of buttermilk all at once and stir carefully until all flour is dampened, then bring together into a dough. Turn the dough out onto a lightly floured surface. We then have to roll it into a 1/2 inch thick and then cut with a 2-inch round cutter to make 12 biscuits. Next on our prison menu is candied sweet potatoes. A dish that I've never tried before, but as a Brit is the real point of curiosity in terms of Thanksgiving food. So given that I've never even tasted one before, here's a recipe for orange candied sweet potatoes from 1932. The recipe doesn't give any guidance on how to prepare the sweet potatoes beyond peeling them. So I'm peeling them and cutting them into small cubes to allow the mix that we're about to make to spread evenly. In a bowl, we then need to add 250 ml of water, 250 ml of orange juice, 1/2 teaspoon of orange peel, 50 grams of sugar, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 20 grams of butter, and 3 tablespoons of light corn syrup, but because I don't live near a Sweetums factory, I'm going for golden syrup instead. Lay down your sweet potato cubes into a casserole dish and pour the mix over, stirring it through. Once cooked, we need to add a layer of marshmallows and brown them. Now it's finally time to plate up. To a plate, or a makeshift prison tray, I'm adding one of our hot biscuits, a dollop of our candied sweet potatoes, some nice thick slices of our juicy turkey, our celery stuffing, some buttered peas, and a slice of pumpkin pie for after. The first thing we're going to have to tackle is the candied sweet potato, because again, the idea of combining an already sweet potato with marshmallows feels a bit strange, but let's give it an old try. What? Do people actually have this with a roast turkey? No, they can't, surely. I mean, it's delicious, it really is, but it's so sweet. That's a pudding, surely. Let's settle this. We've got our turkey. We need to cover it in some of our lovely gravy. Let's see what happens when we pair it with candied orange sweet potato and marshmallow. This honestly makes no sense to me. There's a culture gap and there's a nostalgia gap here, clearly. Let's try the celery stuffing. It's the most anemic form of stuffing I think I've ever tried. But equally well, if I ate it in Alcatraz Prison, then yeah, might have something extra to be thankful for. I'm gonna try the biscuits next. I think I have a depth problem. Let's try dipping in a bit of the gravy. Biscuits and gravy, that's the thing, isn't it? I'm not doing this for comic effect. There are 2 problems with this recipe. The first is that it hasn't risen, and the second that it turns to glue in your mouth. Clearly the recipe has been improved since then. It's the sweet potato mix I just cannot get behind. I mean, I'm genuinely debating turning the leftovers into a pudding and just not telling my friends what it is. This was my first Thanksgiving candied sweet potato. I think the flavors here probably get lost somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean. But you know, the turkey's tasty and the gravy's amazing, so that's a lot to be thankful for.